bringing you some breakouts and sleepers for week 8 fantasy football. And we started off with our breakouts for the week. And the first player we're going to be talking about is going to be Jaylen Waddle for the Miami Dolphins. And hear me out with Jaylen Waddle. We got Tua Tagovailoa coming back. And with Tua Tagovailoa coming back, this means that for as much as we have been in the dirt with Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle, we are back, baby. We look back at week 1 versus Jacksonville, where he put up 16 fantasy points, had a 72% snap share, 5 targets for 5 receptions for 109 yards. Since that game, our poor Jaylen Waddle has not eclipsed double-digit fantasy points. Now, the main reason that is the case is because of no Tua Tagovailoa. So add in Tua Tagovailoa back into this matchup. I'm busting, pushing forth Jaylen Waddle to be an absolute breakout for fantasy football this week. Have him as a top 21 wide receiver. Got to feel great about this matchup versus the Arizona Cardinals. Lock and load Jaylen Waddle into your starting lineup or in a flex spot. The time is now. The second breakout for week 8 fantasy football, it's going to be Chris Olave. Now, Chris Olave is coming off of a concussion, so we'll have to see if he actually clears concussion protocol. Like I said, recording this on Thursday night. Well, this is coming out on Friday. The thing is with Chris Olave, we now have no Rashid Shaheed in the wide receiver room, and Rashid Shaheed, to be honest, was kind of taking Chris Olave's cookies, absolutely destroying the upside that we thought Chris Olave had this year. So I am pumped with no Rashid Shaheed, which stinks because I did have him on a bunch of lineups, but I am excited for my Chris Olave stocks because I do think we could be looking at him getting back to kind of where he was in week 3 and week 4, where he averaged 20 and 16 fantasy points in that week 3 and 4 game. Like I said, he was a full practice on Thursday, so we're assuming he's going to be fully back from that concussion. But like we said, can he get somewhere in a 10 target range in a great matchup versus the Los Angeles Chargers? Now, the Los Angeles Chargers have been a pretty good defense, and so I think they're going to have to come back in the second half. They're going to have to be throwing the ball a ton, which is going to benefit a guy like Chris Olave, and there's a reason that I put Chris Olave as a breakout for week 8 fantasy football. We move on to my next breakout for week 8 fantasy football, and it's going to be Xavier Worthy for the Kansas City Chiefs. And the part that we do need to talk about with Xavier Worthy is the fact that we have DeAndre Hopkins sliding in. And in the absence of Rashee Rice, Xavier Worthy has, let's just be clear, has not been that type of guy. He had 5 fantasy points in week 7, had the 6th bye, but honestly, 11 and 16 fantasy points in week 5 and week 4. We were hoping for a higher ceiling. It has been pretty much big play or bust for Xavier Worthy. Going forward with DeAndre Hopkins, I think if DeAndre Hopkins can kind of take over that Rashee Rice role, the Juju Smith-Schuster role that we saw in week 7, and kind of go forward and really help create space for Xavier Worthy to go deep, do verticals, do end arounds, I think that's only going to help Xavier Worthy. And I think in this week 8 game, it's hard for us to imagine what DeAndre Hopkins' overall snap count is going to be. But the part that we do know about Xavier Worthy is he's going up against the Las Vegas Raiders, which is an absolutely great matchup for Xavier Worthy. So definitely have Xavier Worthy as my next level breakout. My 4th level breakout for this week, it's going to be Juan Jennings. And we saw the breakout a few weeks ago. So like we said, this is meaning for this week in the way that I'm viewing the fantasy football points, because you could say, yes, Juan Jennings broke out in week 3, had 46 fantasy points. But since that 46-point day, of course, we had Debo, we had Brandon Ayuk starting over him, 11, 2, and 5 fantasy points. Now we have no Debo, no Brandon Ayuk for this week. And so we're looking at Juan Jennings. Can he get back to having a 46-point day? I am not personally projecting him to get that amount of points in this week 8 matchup versus the Dallas Cowboys, which is a great matchup for the 49ers. But I do think Juan Jennings is a guy that has ultimate level, breakout level upside. Now, Juan Jennings did not practice on Thursday, so definitely be monitoring that fantasy football report for Juan Jennings. But going forward, definitely be targeting Juan Jennings. I think he's a huge breakout, especially in the absence of Debo and Brandon Ayuk. And going forward, past this week, I do think Juan Jennings has more rest of season value just because he probably slides into that wide receiver 2 role next to Debo Samuel. We bring on to our next breakout player, and it's going to be Rachaad White for the 49ers. And we're looking at Rachaad White, yes, has Bucky Irving taken his cookies? 100%. But when we're looking at this week in particular, we got Bucky Irving, who is dealing with an injury. We got a great matchup, Tampa Bay Buccaneers versus the Atlanta Falcons. So definitely need to be taking into consideration some Rachaad White. Have him projected as a potential breakout this week. Now, we're going to talk about his backfield running mate, Sean Tucker, a little bit later because I do think Sean Tucker gets some value. But Rachaad White this last week had himself quite the day where we're looking at Rachaad White versus Baltimore. Did have 10 attempts for 40 yards, but did have 6 targets for 6 receptions and 2 total touchdowns. I'm not saying he's going to get 2 total touchdowns again, but if he's able to get the work that we assume Rachaad White's going to be doing, then I'm super pumped to be having him as a breakout in this video. And going forward, I definitely think Rachaad White is worthy of an RB2/flex level consideration this week. Now, moving on to some sleepers that are being a little bit sleeped on this week. Number 1 player is going to be Rico Dowdle for me for the Dallas Cowboys. Rico Dowdle, another guy that we love to see getting some run, and he was a little bit of a breakout earlier this year, but going up against San Francisco, a little bit harsher of a matchup. In the 2 games prior to this, Dowdle has played a 45 to 50% snap share, so we'd love to see him get more run than just kind of where he's been at. So I just really believe, even with the crappy snap share that Rico Dowdle has had, that we're going to continue to start him. Like we said, the week 4, week 5 game made me super excited for Rico Dowdle. I'm confidently starting him this week in my RB2 spot. It's a terrible matchup for the San Francisco defense, but this Dallas Cowboys team is going to have to compete offensively, and so I think that does lean good things for Rico Dowdle as a sleeper. My next sleeper for this week, it is going to be JSN, and the main reason that JSN, you could maybe argue, Caleb, is he a breakout, is he a sleeper? Really, for me with JSN this week, we got the potential that DK Metcalf may not play, and so JSN, it might be the Tyler Lockett JSN show. Listen, he's wide receiver 39 on a fantasy points per game this year, 3.8 fantasy points in week 7. It was not great by any stretch of the imagination, but did have 6 targets for 3 receptions and 9 total yards. That ain't cutting it for you. The week before wasn't cutting it for you. Really hasn't done anything since week 2. And that's me saying that as an Ohio State fan. You guys see the jerseys behind me. But in this matchup versus Buffalo, it's a really great matchup for Seattle, especially to kind of have to continue to keep up with this Bills offense. So absolutely love a little bit of JSN. I loved Kenneth Walker in my must start video yesterday. I'm in on JSN this week. Think the value is there, especially with or without DK Metcalf. Definitely think he is a sleeper. Now, the next sleeper we're going to be talking about, it's going to be Cedric Tillman for the Browns. And Cedric Tillman's a little bit deeper of a sleeper, mainly because he's kind of taken over this wide receiver 1 role for the Browns. Jerry Jeudy, we'll have to see what he's dealing with that injury. He produced 81 yards in that week 7 defeat, 12 targets for 8 receptions, 81 yards. We got Jameis, Mr. 30 for 30 himself, back there slinging the rock. We'll have to see what this happens for this team. I love me some Cedric Tillman, especially if you're playing in a little bit of a deeper league. I understand he's been a very popular waiver wire addition this week, but I think he's a sleeper to go back-to-back weeks with eclipsing double-digit fantasy points, which is super exciting for a sleeper level player like Cedric Tillman. The next sleeper we're going to be talking about, it's going to be Sean Tucker for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And when we're looking at Sean Tucker, Bucky Irving is not playing this week. That makes Sean Tucker the RB2. Slide him in next to Rachaad White. Now, the last time we saw Sean Tucker really have any sort of significant playing time, 38% snap share, he put up 34 fantasy points in full PPR versus New Orleans in week 6. Now, it was a very popular waiver wire target in week 7, only put up 4.8 fantasy points, had a 20% snap share. So if he can get back, not saying that he's going to also score 34 fantasy points again, because he did have 2 total touchdowns in that day, but if he can get somewhere around 10 to 11 carries, I think Sean Tucker is an absolute sleeper, especially versus Atlanta. The Bucs are going to have to find ways to get weapons involved. They're going to have to figure out ways to move the ball down the field. Baker Mayfield isn't the best. He's mobile, but he likes to check the ball down a lot. That's going to benefit Rachaad White, like we were talking about earlier. I think it's also going to benefit a guy like Sean Tucker being able to slide in, especially assuming there's going to be no Bucky Irving playing this week. And my last and final sleeper, if we're looking at the quarterback rankings, Bo Nix is very interesting to me this week. I have him as a top 15 quarterback, and he's been going up my rankings. Main thing is going up against the Carolina defense. This Carolina team absolutely in shambles. And so Bo Nix, he's QB8 in fantasy points per game. Last week only had 14, 21 the week before that, but 23. So he's kind of started to pick things up. The big thing has been that rushing attempts, where in the games where he does put up really great fantasy football points, he typically has like a really great rushing floor. Like if you look at last week, had 10 attempts for 75 yards. The week before that, 6 attempts for 61 yards. So if Bo Nix can be the Konami code level quarterback to just get you by, especially if you're super desperate with some injuries or your quarterback situation, I do think Bo Nix could be a sleeper option for you in week 8 fantasy football. So if you like fantasy football, if you like winning a fantasy football championship, hit that like and subscribe button on the way to 4,000 subscribers. Check out these 2 videos if you haven't, and I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.